Las Vegas, late 1960s. A casino showroom packed past comfort. The lights are warm. The tables are close. Money is sitting where applause should be. On stage stands the evening host. Not a comic chasing laughs. Not a performer building a career. He's connected to the people who own the walls, the doors, the licenses. He smiles, lets the room settle, then delivers a joke about the Rat Pack. It isn't vulgar. It isn't direct. It's careful. The kind of joke that can be denied later. The room laughs. Too long, too eagerly. Laughter that doesn't fade on its own. Laughter that waits to see who will stop first. The camera drifts across the audience. A few hands don't clap. A few faces stay still. Some people aren't watching the stage anymore. They're watching one table. Dean Martin is sitting there. At first, nothing changes. Then, quietly, his expression empties. No anger, no surprise. Just a clean withdrawal, like a door closing without a sound. Anyone who understands Las Vegas feels it immediately. This wasn't written for humor. It wasn't meant to be clever. It was a message delivered in public, disguised as entertainment. And Dean understands something the room is still catching up to. In this city, jokes are never just jokes. They're tests, and how you react decides what happens next. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. Las Vegas in the early 1960s did not announce how it worked. It didn't need to. The rules lived in the pauses between conversations, in who was allowed to be late, in which doors opened without knocking. On the Strip, the lights suggested celebration, but beneath them ran a quieter economy. Permissions, favors, silences. The shows were decoration. The real business happened elsewhere. Performers were the most visible part of the system and the least powerful. Their faces sold rooms. Their names filled seats. But the schedules, the contracts, the last-minute adjustments came from people who never stepped onto a stage. Money moved sideways, not forward. If something went wrong, it was never wrong by accident. The Rat Pack fit perfectly into that machinery. To the public, they were friendship and swagger, laughter and late nights. To the city, they were leverage. They brought gamblers who stayed longer, drank more, spent without counting. As long as they entertained and didn't improvise beyond what was expected, they were welcome. As long as they remembered the limits. Dean Martin understood this better than most. He was not the loudest, not the sharpest with a microphone, not the one who pushed boundaries for applause. He arrived on time. He hit his marks. He said little off stage and even less on record. For the people who ran the rooms, that made him ideal. Predictable income with no complications. Which is why the moment passed almost unnoticed at first. The host's joke landed mid-set, tucked between applause and a music cue. It was supposed to be harmless, approved, cleared earlier in the afternoon with a nod and a laugh, the kind of line that brushed close to the truth but never crossed it. Except this time, there was an extra beat. A word added, an emphasis that hadn't been there before. Laughter broke out, too fast, too loud. Then it thinned. Not because the joke failed, but because something in it shifted the room. People laughed, and immediately checked who else was laughing. Glasses stopped halfway to mouths. A few heads turned toward the wings. Dean Martin was still at the microphone. His posture didn't change. No raised eyebrow. No grin widening into a comeback. He let the laughter run its course, and then did nothing at all. He waited, eyes calm, hands loose at his sides, as if listening for something only he could hear. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was crowded with glances. The band held, uncertain. A security man near the aisle leaned forward, then straightened, pretending he hadn't. A manager behind the curtain stopped breathing for a second too long. Dean didn't fill the gap. He didn't rescue the moment or smooth it over. He moved on as if the joke had never existed, delivering the next line exactly as written, exactly as rehearsed. The rhythm of the show resumed, but the temperature didn't. What unsettled people wasn't restraint, it was recognition. The added accent hadn't been a mistake. It was a test, small, public, and deniable. Something slipped in to see if he would swat it away or swallow it. Dean Martin did neither. By the end of the number, applause returned, but it sounded managed, polite, too deliberate. He acknowledged it with a nod and stepped back, leaving the stage as cleanly as he'd entered. No one stopped him. No one followed immediately. Backstage, the air felt heavier than it should have. Conversations resumed in low voices, careful not to connect. A few smiles didn't quite reach their owner's eyes. The host avoided the mirror. Someone adjusted a tie that didn't need adjusting. Dean passed through without comment. No questions. No remarks about timing or taste. That absence traveled faster than any complaint. People who understood how the city worked felt it register, like a dropped chip no one dared pick up. In Las Vegas, noise could be negotiated. Silence could not. The corridor behind the stage looked the same as it always had. Muted lights, scuffed walls, the quiet smell of tobacco that never quite left. Yet the movement inside it had changed. People passed one another without stopping. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Several men who normally would have greeted Dean Martin with easy familiarity found reasons to study their shoes or adjust paperwork they had already checked twice. No one explained the joke. No one apologized for it either. That absence was deliberate. Dean noticed who didn't meet his eyes more than who did. A junior manager turned too sharply at the corner. A musician lingered longer than necessary, packing his instrument. Small behaviors, but together they formed a pattern. Something had been said on stage that wasn't meant to be discussed afterward. He reached his dressing room and closed the door. The room was quiet, except for the low hum of the air unit. Dean poured a drink and let it sit untouched. He didn't pace. He didn't sit. He waited. A knock came, light and careful, as if the door itself might object. The man who stepped in did not introduce himself. He didn't need to. He wore no jewelry that suggested money, no confidence that suggested power. His suit was clean but unremarkable, chosen to be forgotten the moment he left the room. The kind of person whose name never appeared on paperwork and never needed to. He smiled politely, keeping his hands visible. "Just wanted to make sure everything landed the right way tonight," he said. His voice was even, conversational. It was meant as humor, nothing more. Dean looked at him for a long moment before responding. Not challenging, measuring. He glanced briefly at the untouched glass, then back at the man. "I heard it," Dean said. That was all. The smile held for a fraction of a second longer than it should have. The man nodded, as if satisfied, but his shoulders tightened. He had expected more. Irritation, a joke in return, at least a signal of where the line now stood. Instead, he had been given nothing to respond to. "Good," the man said after a pause. "We all appreciate your professionalism." Dean didn't reply. He stepped past him and opened the door. The meeting ended without ceremony. Down the hall, the man stood still for a moment, replaying the exchange. The absence of reaction bothered him more than anger would have. Anger could be framed, redirected, softened. Silence sat where it couldn't be touched. By the next morning, the joke had already been folded into a larger context. It wasn't isolated. It was the third in a string of small, almost forgettable remarks over the past months. Previously, they had happened late, off mic, or without witnesses who mattered. This one had been delivered cleanly, publicly, and recorded. That detail mattered. Dean knew it before anyone explained it to him. The pattern was clear now, a gradual adjustment, a reminder disguised as humor, an attempt to see whether he would play along, deflect, or signal discomfort. So far, he had allowed the moments to pass. This one was different because it wasn't meant to pass unnoticed. Others around him began to react. One voice suggested laughing it off next time, taking control of the room with charm. Another hinted that pushing back gently might earn respect. A third advised him to let someone else handle it quietly. Dean listened without interrupting, without agreeing. When the suggestions ran out, he thanked them and changed the subject. Over the next 2 days, his schedule shifted. Nothing dramatic. A rehearsal moved, a meeting postponed, one favorable slot reassigned without explanation. Each change came with an apology that sounded rehearsed, as if the words had been chosen carefully in advance. None of it was accidental. What unsettled people wasn't the pressure. It was the speed with which Dean adjusted to it. He didn't complain. He didn't ask for clarification. He didn't call anyone who might intervene on his behalf. He continued exactly as before, arriving when expected, delivering his performances with the same precision, leaving without comment. By the time anyone realized he had understood the situation in full, it was already too late to pretend it was nothing. The test had been noticed, and that meant the next move would matter far more than the first. The pressure didn't arrive loudly. It seeped in through logistics, through the kind of changes that could be explained away if someone wanted to pretend hard enough. A call came early one morning to confirm a rehearsal time. An hour later, another call corrected it. By noon, the rehearsal was no longer necessary. No one sounded nervous. Everyone sounded practiced. Dean marked the changes in his head and said nothing. A preferred time slot disappeared from his calendar the following night. Not replaced, simply gone. The explanation arrived late and thin, a scheduling conflict that hadn't existed the week before. His name still carried weight, but the ground beneath it was being tested, inch by inch. Around him, the mood shifted. Jokes lost their ease. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. The Rat Pack, usually careless in their confidence, began circling the subject without naming it. One of them suggested easing the edge, softening things with a public laugh. Another proposed turning the situation into a bit. Control the narrative before it hardened. A third hinted that silence could be mistaken for weakness. Dean listened, hands folded, expression neutral. When they finished, he didn't argue. He didn't agree either. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and said he had a show to prepare for. That was when the first cancellation landed. The club manager delivered the news personally, which was unusual. His tone was respectful, his reasoning vague. Technical issues, renovations, nothing to do with performance or ticket sales. He avoided specifics and thanked Dean for understanding before Dean had a chance to respond. Understanding wasn't the point. By now, it was clear this had nothing to do with money. The rooms were still full when Dean performed elsewhere. The crowds hadn't thinned. The cancellation wasn't punishment. It was a question, a quiet one, but unmistakable. How much did he need the city? Others felt the tension more sharply than he did. Agents worried aloud. Musicians asked whether the set list should change. A few people urged him to make a call, remind someone of old favors, reassert position. Each suggestion assumed the same thing, that the situation required an immediate correction. Dean didn't see it that way. He treated every performance as if nothing were wrong. He didn't speed up. He didn't lean into the crowd. He didn't sharpen his humor or dull it. The consistency became unsettling. It denied observers the feedback they expected. No frustration, no compliance, no visible calculation. Behind the scenes, the logic of the pressure grew clearer. This was not about removing him. That would have caused noise, drawn attention, raised questions. This was about narrowing options, about creating a sense of inevitability. If he adjusted himself, even slightly, the message would land. If he reached out, the channels were ready. He did neither. The calm unnerved people more than resistance would have. Resistance could be escalated. Calm required interpretation. By the end of the week, another venue quietly reinstated a date it had dropped days earlier. No announcement, no explanation. Just a phone call confirming the original arrangement as if the interruption had never occurred. That inconsistency sparked confusion among those managing the situation. Signals were crossing. Instructions weren't aligning. Dean noticed. He filed it away without comment. What others called patience was something else entirely. He wasn't waiting because he had no choice. He was waiting because timing mattered. Responding too early would have validated the pressure. Responding too late would have allowed it to harden into assumption. So he held his position, still precise, unyielding in its quiet. Those who believed they were testing him began to realize they were being observed in return. The pressure arrived without fingerprints. It showed up in details that looked harmless when viewed alone and deliberate when placed side by side. A driver failed to appear one afternoon, replaced by someone unfamiliar who asked too many questions and wrote too little down. A sound check was shortened without warning. A hotel suite usually reserved for Dean was suddenly unavailable, reassigned with polite regret, and no alternative offered. None of it rose to the level of insult. That was the point. Dean adjusted without comment. He arrived earlier. He rehearsed longer. He asked for nothing to be corrected. The people around him, however, felt every shift. They spoke in lower voices, glancing toward doors before finishing sentences. They tried to read his face for cues, and found none. The Rat Pack sensed the change immediately. They had lived too long inside systems not to recognize pressure when it changed shape. One of them laughed it off, suggesting a sharp joke on stage could flip the dynamic. Another warned that jokes could be twisted, recorded, reused. A third leaned closer and spoke quietly about smoothing things over, reminding the city who filled its rooms. Dean let them talk. When they finished, he nodded once, thanked them for their concern, and asked if anyone had seen the updated sheet music. The conversation stalled, awkward and unfinished. He had acknowledged their worry without adopting it. The next signal was clearer. A venue that had booked him months in advance called late in the evening. The voice on the line was careful, respectful, almost apologetic. There had been a sudden change in direction. Programming adjustments, nothing personal. They hoped to work together again soon. The line went dead before Dean could respond. This wasn't retaliation. Retaliation would have been loud. This was calibration. He understood then what was being measured. Not his popularity. Not his earning power. His reflex. Would he push back? Would he ask why? Would he send someone else to negotiate on his behalf? He did none of it. Instead, he showed up the next night as scheduled elsewhere and delivered one of the cleanest sets of his career. No edge added. No warmth withdrawn. Each song placed exactly where it belonged. Each pause held just long enough to remind the room that control did not require volume. The contrast unsettled those watching closely. Panic began to travel in quiet directions. Managers compared notes and found inconsistencies. A decision made in one office had been quietly reversed in another. Instructions arrived late, or not at all. The pressure, meant to be invisible, was starting to reveal its seams. Dean noticed the reversal before anyone explained it. A previously cancelled slot reappeared on his calendar, unchanged, without apology. When he asked no questions, the person delivering the update seemed almost disappointed. That reaction confirmed everything. This was no longer about correction. It was about endurance. Someone expected him to blink first, to fill the silence with reassurance or defiance, to make the situation legible again. Dean refused. He understood something others missed. Silence was not absence. It was space. And space made people nervous. In that space, intentions leaked, contradictions multiplied, authority hesitated. By choosing not to respond, he had shifted the weight of the moment onto those applying pressure. They were now responsible for explaining the inconsistency, to themselves, to one another. The longer he remained unchanged, the harder that explanation became. Those who believed they were testing his limits began to feel their own exposed. And Dean Martin, calm at the center of it, continued exactly as before. Not because nothing was happening, but because everything was. The invitation arrived on heavy paper, delivered by hand, impossible to misread or ignore. A charity gala, formal, televised. The kind of evening where attendance was framed as generosity but functioned as obligation. Every seat in the room would be occupied by someone whose opinion carried weight. Casino owners, financiers, local politicians, executives whose names never appeared in programs. Declining would have been noticed. Attending would be interpreted. Dean accepted without comment. The night unfolded with deliberate precision. The hall was dressed in restraint rather than excess. Dark wood, muted light, a stage positioned just low enough to suggest intimacy while keeping control firmly with the audience. Cameras were everywhere but never obvious. Their angles had been chosen carefully in advance. Dean took his seat near the front, not the center, close enough to be visible, far enough to feel exposed. Conversations around him ebbed and flowed, polite and cautious. People smiled more than they spoke. Laughter arrived early and left quickly. When the host stepped onto the stage, the room adjusted. This wasn't a comedian testing material. This was someone briefed, rehearsed, and protected. The opening remarks were safe, charitable, forgettable. Applause came on cue. Then the tone shifted. The joke was familiar in structure, but harsher in execution. Same underlying idea as before, sharpened just enough to cut. A reference to image, to reputation, to habits the public enjoyed pretending were harmless. This time, the punchline lingered a fraction longer than necessary. Some laughed immediately. Others didn't. A few looked straight at Dean without realizing they were doing it. The cameras tightened their frame. The host continued, adding a second line, unnecessary, pointed. The humor was still technically clean, still defensible if challenged, but the intent was unmistakable now. This wasn't humor drifting off course. It was direction. The room waited. Dean didn't move. No smile. No tightening of the jaw. No glance toward the cameras or the stage. He remained exactly as he had been moments before, hands resting loosely, posture relaxed. His eyes stayed forward, attentive, as if listening to a speech that required no response. The host finished the joke and hesitated. A beat too long. The rhythm broke. Applause followed, uneven and short-lived. Dean remained seated through it. Only when the sound had fully died did he rise. Slowly, without urgency. He didn't adjust his jacket or look around for acknowledgement. He stepped into the aisle and walked toward the exit with measured pace, each step audible in the sudden quiet. Chairs shifted. Someone dropped a program. A whisper started and stopped. The cameras stayed on him longer than planned before finally cutting away. No one followed. No one called out. The host did not attempt another joke. The evening, though not officially over, had lost its shape. Dean exited the building without pause. The night air felt cooler than expected. A car door opened, closed. The engine started. And just like that, he was gone. Inside, the gala continued in name only. Conversations fractured. People checked watches they hadn't checked all evening. The program shortened itself without announcement. What had been designed as a controlled moment turned into something else entirely. An unresolved silence too large to fill. The mistake became obvious in retrospect. They had tried to force a reaction in public, believing visibility would create pressure. Instead, they had given him a stage he refused to stand on. By leaving without protest, without expression, he denied them every outcome they had prepared for. No scandal to contain, no defiance to punish, no humor to redirect. Only absence. By the time the last guests filtered out, it was clear the balance had shifted. The city understood confrontation. It understood negotiation. What it did not understand was refusal without explanation. And now, everyone knew the next move would not be theirs to make. The change was quiet enough that most people missed it at first. Dean Martin didn't announce anything. There were no statements, no explanations passed through managers or columnists. His name simply began appearing in different places. A short run of shows in Los Angeles, then San Francisco, venues that didn't rely on Vegas permission or Vegas patience. Rooms that booked on reputation alone and asked no questions about local politics. To outsiders, it looked like routine scheduling. To those who understood the system, it was a disturbance. Vegas had always assumed proximity, access, the unspoken belief that its stages were the center of gravity and everything else orbited around them. Dean didn't argue that assumption. He stepped out of it. The effect was immediate. Calls went unanswered longer than usual. Messages were returned with polite delays. People who once spoke with certainty began phrasing things as suggestions. Not because they had lost authority, but because they no longer knew where to apply it. Dean moved through the West Coast dates without spectacle. No jokes about the situation, no pointed remarks. The shows were tight, disciplined, and stripped of excess. Audiences responded with attention rather than noise. Reviews followed, measured, and unexpectedly serious. Words like control, weight, and precision appeared where charm used to dominate. Then came the second shift. A television recording was scheduled quietly, framed as routine entertainment. No controversy attached, no obvious reason to object. Dean agreed, again without comment. But when the taping began, something felt different immediately. The set was restrained, the pacing slower. The songs chosen carefully. Not the familiar wink, not the comfortable looseness people expected. His voice carried more space, more intention. The humor, when it appeared, was dry and brief, never asking for approval. Viewers noticed. Critics noticed more. The performance didn't trend. It settled. It stayed. Discussions followed that had nothing to do with gossip or persona. They focused on craft, on authority, on the fact that Dean Martin, long framed as effortless, had revealed something harder beneath the surface. In Vegas, this was read correctly, and all at once. He wasn't leaving. He wasn't hiding. He was relocating the center of attention without asking permission. The city could no longer claim him as an asset it managed. He had become a variable it reacted to. Intermediaries scrambled. Conversations overlapped and contradicted. One message suggested waiting him out. Another urged re-engagement. A third warned that pressure now would only confirm what was becoming obvious, that the leverage had already slipped. Dean did not respond to any of it. He continued his schedule. He fulfilled commitments. He made no effort to repair or inflame. That consistency forced everyone else to move around him, adjusting plans that no longer aligned. What made the shift irreversible wasn't defiance. It was clarity. By stepping away without drama, Dean demonstrated something the system hadn't prepared for. Independence without rebellion. He hadn't broken rules. He hadn't challenged authority. He had simply made himself unavailable to it. Those who once tested his limits now struggled to define them. And somewhere between the final note of a California show and the silence that followed its applause, it became clear that when Dean returned to Vegas, it would not be on anyone else's terms. When Dean Martin returned to Las Vegas, there was no announcement to soften it. No billboards went up. No advance stories appeared in the papers. His name surfaced quietly on a schedule that circulated among staff before it reached the public. One night, one room, no rat pack. No framing that suggested a moment. The city noticed anyway. By the time the doors opened, the tension was already set. Ushers spoke more softly than usual. Floor managers checked sightlines twice. The host, chosen for restraint rather than charisma, reviewed his notes until the edges bent. The audience felt it too, even if they couldn't name it. The room filled without chatter. Laughter came late and died early. Everyone remembered what had happened the last time a joke went too far, and no one wanted to be responsible for the next one. Dean waited in the wings, alone. No entourage, no conversation. Just the low hum of the room bleeding through the curtain. When his cue came, he stepped forward at an unhurried pace, as if this were any other night. The applause rose, full but controlled, and settled when he lifted a hand, not commanding silence, simply accepting it. He began without preface. The performance unfolded cleanly. No improvisation. No invitations for response. His voice carried steady and unforced, each song placed with intention. The humor, when it appeared, was minimal and dry, never touching the edge that had caused so much movement months earlier. What struck the room wasn't what he avoided. It was what he didn't need. There were no glances toward the wings, no pauses waiting for reaction. He held the space without effort, not pressing, not retreating. The audience followed, instinctively quieter than usual, listening rather than participating. The absence of tension became its own presence. When the set ended, the applause came late but deep. Not explosive. Sustained. He acknowledged it with a nod and left the stage the same way he had entered, without commentary, without signal. Backstage was still. A small group waited, positioned carefully near the corridor. Not managers, not performers. People whose roles didn't require introduction. Their faces carried no threat and no warmth, only recognition. One of them spoke, keeping his voice low. "No hard feelings," he said. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a warning. It was a conclusion. Dean met his eyes and gave a single nod. Not triumphant, not dismissive, simply final. There was nothing more to say. The group stepped aside. No one followed him as he walked down the hall. The door closed behind him with a sound too ordinary for what it marked. The message traveled faster than any statement ever could. There would be no more jokes. Not because they were forbidden, because they were no longer safe. The line had been redrawn without ceremony, without confrontation, without spectacle. In a city built on noise, Dean Martin had reset the balance with quiet. And that quiet, for those who understood it, was louder than anything that had come before.